Daniel.
How you doing, Jack?
Fine. Thank you so much for joining us today, June the 23rd, 2010, to visit about your most recent experience as chairman of Deacons. Danny, you grew up in this church, I know, and you probably are well familiar with what's in this book. I was not until just a few years back, but it has been particularly helpful to me as a new member of this church to find out the history that's recorded in here. And I do a little commercial here. Our Archives and History Committee has a supply of these, and they are always looking for ways to distribute them to new members and so on. But I just thought I would comment on this wonderful history book, the history of our church. Danny, you also are aware, I know, of our Archives and History Committee and with its current ongoing video project of interviewing each chairman of Deacons at the conclusion of their term of office. And that really is our purpose today. But first, I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about your brother Mike. I did not have the privilege of knowing Mike. I know he died early in life. But I've heard about him, and I know he meant a lot to the life of this church and also to the community as a whole. So just share a little bit about Mike, if you would.
I'll be glad to. Mike was an outstanding young man and quite a character. He loved people about as much as anybody I've ever known, and particularly children. Mike, when he was a child, used to organize the community, the children, and playing games, baseball or football or whatever season might be in. Mike went to Georgia Southern, where he got a degree in recreation, and subsequently went back and got his master's degree. As a matter of fact, Mike served here in the capacity of a youth minister and a recreation director after he got his master's degree in our church. In our church, mm-hmm. Came back here in our church, mm-hmm. But he was instrumental in with the idea of the Family Life Center that we have today.
Oh, yes.
As a matter of fact, there's a plaque there on the wall in his honor. But Mike was a strong Christian and just full of life. Yes. He loved life. He sure
believe
did.
The Troup County Recreation Center is named for him, is it not?
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's been a couple of years ago now, I think. Mike was honored by naming that building after him. Mike had just been promoted to the director for the Troup County Parks and Recreation when he found out he had cancer.
I see.
And he was never able to assume that position. Yes. But I might add, he had served as president of the Parks and Recreation Association for the state of Georgia.
The state of Georgia.
He sure had. Yes. And Mike had served a lot of people and just really loved the church. He was instrumental in starting the program where we have the underprivileged children come to our church every Christmas.
Oh,
he started that program when he was here,
sure enough.
And we still have that today.
So he left quite a legacy.
He did. He really did.
And his wife Gail is a member of our church.
Gail is an active member.
Yes.
Still, she serves a lot of times on Wednesday nights.
Okay.
Serves the meals.
And I believe recently, I know I witnessed a baby dedication here, and I was told that that was somebody who was special to your family.
Yes. Mike and Gail had one son, Paul Daniel. And Paul married Katie Thompson, Ben Thompson's daughter, and Ben is a deacon in our church now. And Paul and Katie had one son, Michael, named after my brother Mike. And then here recently, about a year ago now, they had twins. And Margie and I have twins, so that was kind of special. But they were dedicated.
Those two youngsters, I remember that. Very impressive. Well, now let's reflect, Danny, on your just completed term of office as chairman of Deacons. But you did serve, I believe, for 2 consecutive years, did you not?
This last time, yes, it was 2 consecutive years.
All
That's
right.
correct.
And you said this last time, Jim Lee, who is a history buff, did a little research in this book, I guess, and in other sources of information, and he discovered that you had, over the years, served as chairman of Deacons 5 different terms, 5 different years.
That's correct.
Yeah, well,
I've been honored to be able to serve, and it's been 5 terms. That's correct.
I want you to know that we appreciate so much your commitment to this church and the service that you have rendered to this church over these years. Now, let's turn to a little bit about your biography, if you will, your basic biography, where you were born, your parents' names, and a little bit about your children.
Okay. Well, I was born in Zebulon, Georgia, in 1943, a little one-room doctor's office. My father at the time was in World War II, and my grandparents on my mother's side lived outside of Zebulon in Pike County, and so that's where I was born. My father, Agilon E. Daniel Jr., is from LaGrange, and my mother, Jean Connell, was her maiden name, met while mother was attending LaGrange College.
Oh, yes.
So that's that side of the family. And then I married Margie Thornton. Her parents, Rachel and Jean Thornton, were very active in this church. Jean Thornton, as a matter of fact, was a deacon. And then Margie and I had known each other for a long time. She was a freshman in high school here when I was a senior. And then I went off to school. I went to North Georgia Military School for a couple of years, and then over to Georgia, where I graduated. And then I went to Mercer Law School, and Margie was a student there, and we reacquainted our friendship, and fell in love, and got married.
Yes.
And we have a family. We have 3 sons. Lyle Daniel, who lives here in LaGrange, and Lyle is a builder. He got a degree in building and construction from Georgia Southern. And then Mark Daniel is a physician's assistant, and he does surgery right now over in Augusta. And my other son, David, and they're twins, is a physical therapist. And both of them are going on the foreign mission field for a period of time. They're both married, and Mark has 4 children, and David soon will have 3. And they're going to Peru.
Peru, wonderful.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Let me ask you this, going back to your younger days, I'm sure. When did you make a decision for Christ and join this church?
I joined this church when I was 10 years old. I remember Tom Fields was the minister, and he baptized me. I remember having a discussion with my parents and making that decision. I think it came about as a result of being active in RAs, and also we had training union in those days. And there was a lady named Ms. Patterson, and she was awfully dedicated Christian lady, and they made an impression on me. And, and I felt Christ calling me and accepted Him as my Savior when I was 10 years old.
10 years old. Well, thank you for sharing that, those personal things. Now, let's talk some about your experience as chairman of Deacons in this church, a very important responsibility. And I understand a little bit from my own personal experience of the responsibility that goes with the chairman of Deacons position. Let's talk about the importance of the chairman to both the congregation and the pastor. And I guess talking about traits, what traits would you say, Daddy, that are important in being an effective chairman? And I must confess that my thoughts were on the fruits of the Spirit when I posed this question. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure, be glad to. I think the loyalty from the chairman of deacons position has got to be equal to both the congregation and the pastor. And the fruits of the Spirit, of course, love is one of them, love and joy. But I think the chairman of the deacons has to have a real love for Christ. I think that is the central trait that has to be portrayed. And in trying to relate to both the pastor and the congregation, I think if leaders, not just the chairman of the deacons, will remember our purpose here is to spread the gospel and to realize what Christ did for us, then as we face the various issues that come about in a church, much like they would in a business or any other organization, your approach is a little bit different. You always have to have that love of Christ in trying to resolve matters and in trying to go forward in proclaiming Christ, to remember that love is the most important trait.
Good. And you kind of touched on the relationship of the manager's job, so to speak, as a chairman of deacons in the church with a lot of things going on. And you mentioned like from the business world, so there are differences, I would think. Would you say so?
I think so. I think a church is much like a business. We have financial matters, we have personnel matters, we have organizational matters that all have to be addressed, just as in a business. However, in a church, I think the emphasis has to be more on the love side, and sometimes on the forgiveness side, and being able to help people more so perhaps than a business would get involved into the personal lives, because I think Christ wants us to do that. So.
Danny, what, in your estimation, is the most important responsibility to the pastor, the chairman of deacons, in the pastor relationship?
I think it comes back to the word love that you mentioned before. I think that the chairman of the deacons has to have that brotherly love that Christ talks about. He talked about how he loved his disciples, and there has to be that relationship in being able to advise the pastor when he asks it. Sometimes there may be matters that come up that the pastor's not aware of, and I think the chairman has to advise him if he's aware of something going on in the church that needs his attention. And it comes back to, is the church being focused on spreading the gospel and the love of Christ? And in the case of Dr. Baxter, that was a real easy job, because he is certainly focused on the gospel and speaks so intelligently and well from the pulpit.
Yes.
And the organizations of our church carry out that theme, I think. So that was an easy job.
Well, then, thinking about in the congregation, what, in your estimation, do you consider the most important responsibility you would have as chairman of deacons to the congregation?
I think the most important thing that a chairman needs to do for the congregation is to see, number one, that the needs are being addressed through the deacons. We have the outreach program where the deacons have a ministry to shut-ins, and we also, in recent years, have had an outreach program for people that are coming in. But I think that the chairman of the deacons needs to emphasize to our Sunday school, to all ministries, that our ultimate goal is to lead people to Christ and to take care of those who are within our congregation already.
You've been involved in a leadership position for a long time in this church, Danny, and it's interesting that throughout your years of service and leadership positions, Dr. Paul Baxter, has been pastor of this church.
That's right. he came here not long after we came back in '72. I think he's been here now 27 years. I believe 27 or 28. I can't remember exactly, but he will soon have been with us for 30 years, and he has been the longest standing minister in the history of our church.
Yes,
I think.
that's it.
Yeah.
And throughout this period of time, there's been significant growth in our church in terms of building programs, missions and ministries and that sort of thing. Would you elaborate a little on that?
Yes. My personal opinion about building programs and is that we should not build unless we feel like that the addition of a physical plan or enhancement of a physical facility will help us lead others to Christ, because we cannot forget that that is in fact our goal. I think I've been involved in some capacity in almost every building program. At one time, I was chairman of the building committee when the children's facility was built, and that was quite an experience.
Well, I can imagine.
But we were able to successfully complete it, and it worked out. And I think our children's facility has certainly led a lot of families to want to bring their children here.
Yes, wonderful facility, and I know you're proud of that experience too. Well, then there have been outreach to the world, a lot of missions programs and ministries. I believe you've had some mission teams going to Mexico, to South America. I know this church has helped to start a new church in Montana, and we've started the New Macedonia Baptist Church here in our city. Tell us about those experiences and how they've impacted the lives of people.
I'll be glad to. In 1985 was my first experience with foreign missions. In 1985, our church was called upon to help build a church in Uno de Victoria, Brazil. And we put together a team of about 25 or 30 people, and I regret that I can't call all the names, but I do remember Dr. Giesler, Mike Patton, Mickey McCoy, Boyd Taylor. There were a number of other people. Jim Butts, who has passed away.
Jim Butts told me about his experience once. I sure did.
I can still remember seeing him work there. Mr. Charles Forbes, who's also passed away, the pharmacist, he was on that trip. We went to Brazil to help build this church. And I want to say the missionary's name was Ned Mann. He was subsequently died in an airplane crash. He had a plane to go to his various missions down there in South America. But out of that experience, when we came back, I felt like there was a spiritual surge in our church, because we really, out of that experience, understood a better Christian worldview of Christianity. And many of us came back more dedicated than ever to have a foreign mission service. And then a couple of years ago, when I was chairman, I told Dr. Baxter that I felt like we needed to continue that. And we formed a committee. Ford McLean was chairman of that committee, to investigate and determine what our church could do in the way of foreign missions. And this was really to fulfill the 40 days of purpose that the church had studied. At the end, it was recommended that churches get involved in foreign missions. And so he agreed with me, and Ford did an excellent job. And out of that committee, we have two foreign mission projects today. David Blackwell has been the cornerstone for the one in Mexico, the Yucatan, and Don Lee has been the leader of the mission team down to Honduras. And I had an opportunity in February to go down to Honduras, and there are great needs there, but I think God is leading us in that direction.
Good. Yes.
I would like to mention one mission here in the States, which has meant a lot to me, and I've made some dear friends out of it, and that is the mission to Montana, where we
yes.
support the Montana church.
Right, yes.
And Dr. Baxter has been there several times. We would go there and present programs and to the community and to try to help build that congregation.
Yes, I believe Dave Nichols also had a hand in that.
He was really the leader to help us form that particular mission.
Yes. Well, one thing that I've left out of my litany of these special ministries and mission programs a while ago was the Korean church. That's one that's just recently started, and it's growing as I hear.
That's right. Larry Cousins was the chairman of the Deacons when that church was initiated. And an interesting story there, Larry is a retired colonel, and Larry served in Korea and had a son who served in Korea.
I didn't realize that.
Recently as a soldier. And so Larry had some real reasons for wanting to help the Koreans, and I think that has been very successful. And I'm so glad that we were able to meet that need.
That's great. I think it should be emphasized, Danny, that with all of the things that this church has done and is continuing to do, a third of the budget of this church is designated for missions. And I think that's very, very significant.
I agree with you. I think because of this church and the commitment to missions that God has continued to bless us and to bless our programs, that's been probably the engine that's helped us in many, many ways without realizing it, that we have been generous. I think we talked earlier about one particular incident where we were coming short one year of not meeting the Lottie Moon goal of giving the amount allotted for that particular mission. And Miss Lillian Clark was a dear lady. She was my English teacher, and she's Margie's father's English teacher, and I think Margie's English teacher, but she threatened to take out of her savings account to make up the difference. And I remember the deacons, we all got together and said, we cannot let that happen. We've got to be able to support this mission. And it's that kind of heart desire to want to give and to help and to reach out to the world for Christ that I think has helped us with those, give that 33%.
Yes. Wonderful, wonderful stories like that. Thank you for sharing that. Do you have anything else you would like to comment on related to your experience as chairman of Deacons?
Just one thing that I'd like to talk about is the fact that I think Dr. Baxter has unified our church in a way that can only be done through God working through him. As you know, through the years, churches have differences like any church, and we have had ours. Probably one of the most recent, it's really not a controversy, but agreement on what type of worship style we would have. In our church today, we have three, which is unique. We have the tradition, we have the blended, and then we have the contemporary. And I think that's wonderful that we have so many choices. Of course, the gospel is presented in all three of them.
Yes.
But to his credit, and the Holy Spirit working through him, I think our church has kept its unity, and that's because of Dr. Baxter's love for Christ. And I think our church recognizes that truly what really counts is knowing Jesus, regardless of what type of worship style we might have.
Right. Thank you so much for that. Well, Danny, we do appreciate your willingness to sit with us today and talk about your experiences and your love for this church, your love for Christ. And it's certainly an inspiration to me, and I'm sure it will be to others, not only in this generation, but those in the future generations who will view this videotape, I trust, and gain some insight and some good feelings about what's going on in First Baptist Church on the Square. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'd like to also thank Jim Lee, who is the facilitator for these interviews, and for Paul Barnes, who is the technician that actually does the videotaping. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the History Committee and you and Jim and Paul for doing this, because I think we learn a lot from history, and hopefully this will have some deep meaning to someone else in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Okay.